Disclaimer: the story is a work of creative nonfiction inspired by real events. Some names, locations, and details have been changed to protect privacy. The narrative includes paranormal themes and suspenseful elements intended for mature audiences. Reader discretion is advised. I never imagined that starting over could feel so heavy. After my divorce, I moved into a modest, slightly worn house on the outskirts of town, hoping to create a fresh start, not just for myself, but for the 2 children my new husband had from his previous marriage. His son, Daniel, was quiet, observant, and carried a weight in his eyes that seemed far older than his 12 years. On the surface, he was polite, even reserved, but I sensed a distance that no simple introduction could bridge. My own daughter, Emma, was excited to have new siblings, yet the tension in the air between Daniel and the rest of us was palpable. From the first day, it was clear that Daniel lived in a world apart from everyone else. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and his eyes seemed to follow things I couldn't see. At night, I'd hear him wandering through the hallways, whispering to himself, and sometimes catching him standing silently in corners, staring at shadows that weren't there, or at least, not that I could perceive. My husband reassured me, he's just shy. Give him time. But there was something in the way he moved, deliberate and careful, that unsettled me. The house itself seemed to echo the unease. Floorboards creaked at odd hours, doors closed softly without wind, and the air carried a chill even when the heater was running. I dismissed most of it as my imagination or the quirks of an older home. Still, Daniel noticed. More than once, he'd pause mid-step, his hand hovering in the air as though listening for something beyond ordinary sound. "It's different here," he said once, eyes fixed on a darkened hallway. "You have to be careful." I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but the knot in my stomach tightened. Despite his quiet nature, I wanted to reach him. I tried engaging him with simple conversations, games, and shared meals, but Daniel often seemed lost in thought, as though the house itself demanded his attention. Sometimes, when he spoke, his words were sudden and startling. One evening, as I was arranging the living room, he looked at me with a steady gaze and whispered, almost urgently, "Don't trust the walls. They hear everything." I froze, unsure whether he was joking or serious. It was in those first weeks that I realized Daniel was no ordinary child. There was a sensitivity to him, a perceptiveness that I couldn't ignore. And though our new family life was supposed to bring joy, an undercurrent of something inexplicable began to take shape. Every creak, every flicker of shadow, seemed amplified in his presence, as if he alone could see what was lurking just beyond the corner of my eye. I didn't understand it yet, but I knew one thing. This boy, my stepson, would change my life in ways I could never anticipate. The more time I spent in the house, the more it seemed to reveal its secrets, as if it had a will of its own. At first, they were small, almost trivial things. A door left slightly ajar that I could have sworn I had closed, a shadow passing along the hallway when no one was there, the faint echo of footsteps above me when the children were asleep. I told myself it was an old house, settling and creaking in the night. But Daniel never seemed fooled. His eyes would dart toward the corners, his expression tense, and he would mutter under his breath, warning of things I couldn't yet name. One evening, while unpacking boxes in the living room, I noticed Daniel standing silently near the staircase, frozen in place, staring at the wall across from him. "What is it?" I asked, walking over. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his lips pressed together. "It's watching," he whispered finally, barely audible. My stomach dropped. I forced a smile, thinking he was playing a game, but the fear in his voice made my own heart race. That night, strange occurrences became harder to ignore. I awoke to the sound of soft whispers drifting through the hallways, though no one else was awake. The wind was calm, the windows shut. I checked the rooms empty. Then I noticed small objects slightly out of place, a chair turned, a book on the floor, a photograph tilted at an odd angle. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Daniel, of course, had been right there in the hallway, watching silently. Over the next few days, I started noticing patterns in his behavior. He seemed to know when something unseen was near before I did. He would pause mid-step, listen intently, and sometimes whisper cryptic instructions, "Don't move," or "Not yet." At first, I brushed them off as quirks of imagination, but their accuracy was unnerving. The house, I realized, had layers I could not see or comprehend. It seemed alive in ways that were not meant to be explained. Even during the day, the atmosphere in certain rooms felt different, heavier, oppressive. Daniel would avoid them or linger at the edges, never fully entering. I remember one afternoon when I called him into the kitchen. He hesitated at the threshold of the dining room, glancing back at the empty hallway with wide eyes. "It's not safe," he said softly, and then followed me reluctantly. It was becoming impossible to ignore. Daniel was seeing something I couldn't, sensing what I could not. The house was not just old, it was haunted by memories, shadows, and perhaps something darker. I began to feel a creeping unease, a sense that we were intruding on something that did not want to be disturbed. And Daniel, quiet and vigilant, was the only one who seemed prepared to face it. That realization left me unsettled. I couldn't rely on my own senses anymore. I had to watch him, follow his lead, trust his instincts. My stepson, so withdrawn and cautious, was slowly becoming my guide through a house that whispered, shifted, and threatened in ways I could barely comprehend. And somewhere deep down, I knew that his warnings were only the beginning. Over time, I began to notice that Daniel's quiet warnings were not mere childhood imagination. He had a way of observing the house, of reading its subtle signs, that made me reconsider everything I had dismissed before. He would pause in hallways, listen with uncanny focus, and sometimes shake his head slowly, lips moving as if in conversation with something unseen. At first, I felt frustrated, wondering why he couldn't just ignore it, why he insisted on drawing attention to what I couldn't perceive. But slowly, I began to understand. Daniel was not trying to scare me, he was trying to protect me. It was during one late evening that our bond deepened in a way I hadn't expected. I was folding laundry in the dim light of the bedroom when I heard a soft thump behind me. My heart jumped. I called out, thinking it was Emma, but only Daniel's small, cautious voice answered. "Don't move," he whispered, appearing at the doorway. Before I could respond, he knelt beside me, his hands hovering over mine as if he were shielding me. I froze, confused and alarmed, and for a moment, silence filled the room. The air felt charged, almost electric, and I realized that he sensed something approaching that I couldn't. That night, I began to see him differently. He wasn't just a quiet, distant child, he was vigilant, aware in ways I could not hope to understand. I started paying closer attention to the way he moved through the house, the subtle shifts in his demeanor when something unseen was near. He would sometimes glance over his shoulder, whispering brief, urgent instructions, "Wait," or "Not yet." I began to follow them, hesitant but trusting, and each time I did, I narrowly avoided strange disturbances that would have unnerved me. In the evenings, our quiet moments together became opportunities for him to communicate more openly. He spoke in low tones about things he had experienced in his previous home, odd shadows, whispers, feelings of being watched, and though I could not verify his accounts, the intensity in his voice convinced me they were true. It was as if he carried a sensitivity that allowed him to perceive layers of the world that were invisible to the rest of us. Listening to him, I felt a mixture of fear and admiration. Our bond grew quietly, forged in shared tension and cautious vigilance. I began to rely on his instincts, observing the house through his eyes, sensing the faint stirrings in the air that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. It was an uneasy partnership, but it created a connection that transcended the usual step-parent and stepchild dynamic. He had become my protector, my guide through a world I didn't yet understand. By the time a week had passed, I could no longer see Daniel as merely a quiet, withdrawn boy. He was a sentinel, patient and alert, someone who understood the dangers that lurked in the corners of our home. And although the whispers, the shadows, and the small disturbances continued, I felt a strange comfort in his presence. Whatever this house held, whatever secrets it kept, I was no longer facing it alone. The nights in that house grew heavier, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were breathing. One evening, long after the children were asleep and the house had settled into an uneasy silence, I lay awake in bed, sensing a presence I couldn't see. A soft scratching sound came from the hallway, followed by a faint whispering, so subtle it could have been my imagination. My heart raced. I wanted to call out, but instinctively I stayed still, remembering Daniel's earlier warnings. Then I felt it, a subtle shift in the air, like someone or something moving closer. I tensed, unable to see beyond the shadows cast by the dim moonlight streaming through the curtains. Suddenly, a quiet voice came from the edge of my bed. "Don't move," Daniel whispered, kneeling carefully beside me, his small hand brushing against mine as if to reassure me. His presence alone seemed to anchor me, a lifeline in a night that had suddenly grown impossible. I realized in that moment that he had already faced this fear many times before, and he was guiding me through it. The moments stretched like hours. I could hear the faintest creaks and whispers around the room, shadows shifting unnaturally in the corners. Daniel didn't flinch. He held my hand tightly, whispering again and again to stay calm, to remain frozen, as if any movement might draw the attention of whatever lurked in the darkness. My mind raced with fear, but his steady presence gave me courage I didn't know I had. I tried to focus on him, on the warmth of his hand, the firmness of his voice, rather than the unseen threat surrounding us. As the night progressed, I became aware of subtle changes. The air grew colder, heavier, almost tangible. Objects in the room seemed to vibrate slightly, shadows danced in impossible angles, and the whispering grew just a fraction louder. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to hide, but Daniel's whisper cut through the fear. "Wait. It will pass. Don't move." I obeyed, utterly reliant on him, and slowly, the tension in the room began to ease. The sounds receded, the shadows slackened, until it was just the quiet hum of the old house settling around us. When dawn finally broke, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the curtains, I felt a profound sense of relief. Daniel stayed kneeling for a moment, watching me carefully, making sure I was unharmed. I looked at him with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Here was a child, barely 12, who had seen and understood forces I could barely comprehend, who had protected me through an ordeal that defied logic and reason. I realized then that the house, with all its eerie presence, had forged an unspoken bond between us, one that transcended fear and bloodlines. That night marked a turning point. I no longer doubted Daniel's abilities or his intuition. Whatever haunted that house, whatever lurked unseen in the darkness, he was ready to face it, and he had taught me, in the process, the quiet courage of stillness and trust. From that moment on, I began to see him not just as my stepson, but as my protector, my guide through a world that existed just beyond the veil of ordinary perception. The morning after that harrowing night, Daniel seemed quieter than usual, though there was a certain intensity in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. Over breakfast, I tried to engage him in casual conversation, but he pushed his plate around silently. Finally, I asked gently, "Daniel, can you tell me what you saw last night?" He hesitated, fingers fidgeting with his spoon, then looked up at me with an honesty that made my heart ache. He began to speak in a soft, steady voice, recounting memories from his previous home. "I used to see them there," he said. Shadows moving in the corners, whispering my name. "Mom, she didn't believe me. She didn't listen." His words were fragmented, yet each one carried weight. My stomach tightened. He was talking about real experiences, the kind that could haunt a child for life. I realized that his warnings weren't just instinct, they were learned from survival, from nights of terror he had endured alone. He described figures that moved with unnatural grace, whispers that came from empty hallways, and sensations that made the air itself feel alive. "I tried to warn her," he said quietly, but she didn't hear me. I couldn't stop it. I didn't press him for details. I didn't need to. The fear and resignation in his voice were enough to tell me that Daniel had faced horrors that I couldn't imagine. And now, somehow, he had brought that awareness into our home, into our lives, to protect me. There was a moment of pause, a fragile silence filled with unspoken understanding. I reached for his hand across the table, and he allowed me to hold it. "You saved me last night," I said. "Not just from whatever was in the house, but from myself, my fear." His eyes widened slightly, then softened, and a small, almost shy smile appeared. For the first time, I felt like he wasn't just a child haunted by unseen forces. He was someone capable of courage and strength beyond his years. Over the next few days, he shared more stories, each one revealing his sensitivity to things others could not perceive. He explained the patterns he noticed, the way shadows shifted, how the house seemed to respond to fear and movement. Listening to him, I began to see the world through his eyes. What I had dismissed as creaks, drafts, and imagination now held meaning, a rhythm and logic that only he could decipher. By the time we sat down together one evening, it felt like a new bond had formed. I no longer felt like an intruder in Daniel's world. He wasn't just my stepson, he was my guide through the strange, unsettling dimensions of our home. I realized that his confessions, terrifying as they were also acts of trust. He had chosen to let me in, to let me share in his awareness, and in doing so, he had given me a gift, the chance to face the darkness with him, not against him. From that day forward, our interactions changed. I watched him more closely, listened more intently, and relied on his instincts without question. Each whisper, each warning was no longer a mystery to fear, but a lifeline, a bridge between the ordinary world and the one Daniel inhabited so fully. And in that fragile, powerful trust, I began to understand that the most extraordinary courage often comes from the quietest voices. It was a night I will never forget, the night when everything in the house seemed to converge into one palpable, terrifying presence. The air was thick, heavy, almost suffocating, and a silence hung over the rooms that was deeper than any I had ever known. I felt at the moment I stepped into the living room, a subtle vibration beneath my feet, the faintest hum of energy, like the house itself was holding its breath. Daniel stood near the staircase, tense and alert, his eyes scanning the corners as if he could see into a realm I couldn't even imagine. "Don't move," he whispered, kneeling carefully beside me. I obeyed instinctively, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, dancing along the edges of the room, moving without pattern or sound. I tried to control my breathing, to focus on the warmth of Daniel's hand in mine, as a low, almost imperceptible scratching began along the walls. Then came the whispers, soft, fragmented, calling my name in voices that were both familiar and alien. I felt frozen, trapped between fear and disbelief, yet Daniel remained calm, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos. The minutes, or perhaps hours, stretched endlessly. Heavy footsteps echoed from the upper floor, followed by faint thuds from the walls. Shadows deepened in the corners, swirling, merging, as though testing our resolve. Daniel whispered again, "It's close. Keep still." I dared not move an inch, terrified that any sudden motion would draw attention. His kneeling figure beside me radiated confidence, a quiet bravery that was more powerful than the fear gripping me. For the first time, I realized that his courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. Then, slowly, the intensity began to ebb. The scratching softened, the whispers receded, and the shadows lost their sharp edges, fading into the dim light that filtered through the windows. I was shaking, my body tense from hours of silent vigilance, but Daniel remained steady, watching, waiting until the house itself seemed to relax, as though satisfied that we had survived. Finally, he whispered, "It's over, for now." I exhaled, relief crashing over me, mingled with awe at the child kneeling beside me, who had faced this darkness without hesitation. When morning arrived, the sunlight seemed almost miraculous, streaming through the windows in golden beams. I looked at Daniel, still kneeling, and saw a depth of understanding in his eyes that belied his age. He had guided me through a night of unimaginable terror, teaching me the power of stillness, trust, and instinct. I felt a profound gratitude, an unspoken bond that had been forged in the crucible of fear. That night, I understood the true nature of our connection. Daniel was no longer simply my stepson. He was my protector, my guardian in a world that had revealed its hidden, menacing layers. And though the house would continue to hold secrets and shadows might return, I knew one thing with certainty. We were facing them together, and together, we had survived the night of truth. The days following the night of truth were quiet, almost eerily so, but the tension in the house never fully disappeared. I had survived the darkness, guided by Daniel's instincts, yet I knew the experience demanded more than just passive endurance. We could not simply wait and hope that the house's secrets would remain dormant. I needed answers, and more importantly, I needed to understand the source of the fear that had gripped us. One afternoon, I confided in a local historian, a neighbor, and later a priest known for his knowledge of old homes and their histories. Each account added fragments to the puzzle. Our house had a layered past, built over land tied to tragedy. Stories of sudden deaths, violent arguments, and mysterious disappearances all pointed to energies that lingered, never fully leaving. As I listened, I realized that Daniel's sensitivity was not a mere quirk, it was a rare gift, a natural ability to sense what others could not. His warnings, his whispers, and his quiet vigilance had been our only defense. That evening, as I explained the situation to Daniel, I saw a flicker of relief in his eyes. For the first time, he felt validated. "I wasn't imagining it," he said softly, kneeling beside me, hands clasped in his small, determined way. I knew something was here. I had to be ready. I embraced him, realizing that the bond we had formed in fear and silence was now solidified in understanding and trust. He had faced what others ignored, endured what others would have fled, and emerged with strength far beyond his years. We took practical steps together, rearranging rooms, sealing entry points, and introducing rituals that gave us a sense of control. Each night, Daniel remained vigilant, whispering his instructions when necessary, and I followed without hesitation. The house still creaked, shadows still danced at the edges of vision, but our fear was no longer paralyzing. By acknowledging the presence, by respecting the power it held, we had reclaimed a measure of agency. Over time, I began to observe Daniel in new ways. He noticed patterns invisible to me, subtle shifts in the air or light that signaled movement beyond our perception. Each whisper, each cautionary gesture, became a lesson in attention, patience, and trust. I learned to read the house through his eyes, and in doing so, I discovered a world both terrifying and astonishing, a world in which courage and caution were intertwined. Breaking the silence also meant embracing honesty. Daniel shared more of his past experiences, and I shared my fears and doubts. No longer did I feel the weight of uncertainty alone. Together, we navigated the house's secrets and the lingering shadows. Our home, once a source of anxiety, had transformed into a place where trust and vigilance created a fragile but powerful safety. That chapter of our lives marked a turning point. Daniel had not only survived the darkness, but he had taught me how to face it, how to listen, and how to act with courage. The silence that once separated us from the house's truths had been broken, replaced by a bond forged in shared fear, understanding, and the quiet bravery of a boy who knew far more than his years would suggest. The final chapter of our ordeal was not marked by dramatic confrontations or spectacular displays of power, but by a quiet, unspoken understanding. The house, with all its hidden histories and lingering shadows, remained a place of uncertainty, yet it no longer felt like an enemy. Daniel and I had survived the terror together, and in doing so, had forged a bond that transcended the ordinary relationship between stepmother and stepson. It was a connection born of fear, trust, and mutual protection, a bond sealed in the quiet hours of darkness. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon, Daniel and I sat together in the living room. The house was still, save for the occasional creak of an old floorboard. I watched him kneel beside me, just as he had so many nights before, his small hands steady on mine. There was no whisper this time, only a calm presence, a reassurance that the darkness could not break. In that moment, I realized that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to remain steadfast in its presence. Daniel had embodied this lesson fully, guiding me through nights of terror with a poise far beyond his age. We performed simple rituals to mark the boundaries of our home, candles lit and prayers whispered, not in desperation, but in respect for the energies that lingered. Shadows still moved in the corners of the rooms, and the air sometimes carried a chill that made my skin prickle. Yet the fear that had once gripped me so tightly had loosened. I no longer felt powerless. I felt equipped, supported, and deeply connected to the boy who had become my protector. Over time, our family adjusted to this new reality. My daughter, Emma, began to understand the subtle signs too, though she never fully perceived the unseen forces. We moved forward cautiously, never ignoring the house's warnings, but never allowing them to dominate our lives. Daniel, once a quiet, withdrawn child, had grown into a vigilant, compassionate presence. His whispers and careful guidance had not only saved me, but had reshaped the very foundation of our blended family. Reflecting on those months, I recognized that the true horror of the house was never merely the shadows or the whispers, it was the isolation, the disbelief, and the lack of trust. By acknowledging Daniel's perceptions, by following his instincts, we had transformed fear into a source of connection. That night when he whispered, "Don't move," and knelt beside me, I stopped seeing him as merely a stepson. He was a son in every sense that mattered, a guardian whose bravery had given me the chance to survive and understand a world beyond ordinary sight. The house may always hold its secrets, its shadows, and its silent witnesses. But the bond forged in those nights of fear is unbreakable. Daniel's vigilance, courage, and quiet wisdom have left an indelible mark on my life, one that will guide me whenever darkness threatens. In the end, the terror of the house became the crucible in which our trust, love, and understanding were solidified, creating a family bond that no fear, seen or unseen, could ever undo. 9.